Starving and on the brink of collapse, a wild Mustang stumbled into the heart of a desolate town, each labored step stirring a cloud of dust that hung thick in the hot afternoon air. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. The creature's flanks were scored with raw patches of missing fur, its ribs stark and pronounced through a coat matted with dirt, blood, and sweat. It had wandered from somewhere beyond the low, sage-strewn hills into a cluster of wooden buildings baking in the punishing sun. The town was remote, its population small, barely a couple dozen people trying to eke out a living in a place where the desert tested everyone's resilience. At first sight of the Mustang, a few startled townsfolk rushed out of the saloon, the general store, and the post office. They paused on the wooden walkways, each uncertain whether to approach or keep their distance. No one recognized the horse, and no one could recall ever seeing a Mustang in such a wretched state. In the stillness that followed the Mustang's arrival, a single tumbleweed rolled by as if carried by a faint, dusty breeze. The Mustang's legs trembled with every breath, and the animal's wild eyes darted from side to side, searching for a shred of hope in the blur of faces and buildings. It looked as though it hadn't had a drink in days, weeks, maybe, and it had survived on pure determination up to this point. A hush settled over the street as people tried to read the horse's body language. The wind picked up, rattling loose shutters and stirring grit into the air. A local named Callahan, once a rancher but now a grizzled old man with a limp, instinctively reached for the length of rope at his belt. He didn't intend harm. It was a reflex born of a lifetime working with horses. But the Mustang pinned its ears back and stamped a hoof in alarm. Its near hysterical fear made it dangerous, and no one wanted to escalate the tension. A horse like this, tough enough to survive the wild but now pushed to its limits, was an unpredictable force. Its eyes rolled, nostrils flaring with each exhalation. The hush fractured when a clatter of tin cans spilled from the hands of a startled shopkeeper. That sudden noise shattered the fragile calm. The Mustang jolted, tried to rear, but its battered body gave out beneath the weight of that action. It staggered sideways, smashing its flank into the side of the general store. A lantern that had been hanging from a hook crashed to the ground. Glass splintered, and the townsfolk gasped, unsure if the spark of a broken lantern would ignite the dryness underfoot. Mercifully, no flame caught. Callahan attempted a soothing whistle, hoping to coax the Mustang away from any more chaos. His voice, raspy from a lifetime of barking orders at livestock, carried an edge of concern as he motioned for people to back up. But the horse's hunger and desperation overpowered all sense of caution, and with a sudden lurch, the Mustang lunged toward a nearby trough. The trough was mostly empty, containing only a few inches of stagnant water that had been sitting there for days. Still, to the parched animal, it was salvation. The Mustang thrust its muzzle into the trough and slurped the stale water, inhaling it so greedily that the onlookers feared it might choke. A boy named Ethan, no more than 13, watched the scene with wide eyes, heart pounding. He could see the desperate heaving of the Mustang's ribcage, the foam-flecked muzzle, and he felt a surge of empathy for the suffering beast. In the midst of this tense moment, a chilling sound echoed off the wind, the distant yips of coyotes. Predators, usually skulking around the outskirts of the desert, had caught the scent of something weak and on the verge of death. Their call drifted through the dusty streets like a warning. The Mustang's ears flicked up, a surge of adrenaline guiding its trembling limbs. It lifted its head from the trough, water dripping from its battered muzzle, and jerked away from the sound. Every muscle in its body seemed to cry for rest, yet it remained locked in a state of fight or flight. Coyotes had likely been tracking it for miles, picking at the edges of the Mustang's territory, waiting for the moment when it could no longer fight back. The people who had come out to witness this spectacle began to scatter in alarm. A group of 3 or 4 men, rifles slung over their shoulders, took defensive positions around the Mustang, scanning the horizon for any sign of the approaching coyotes. Nobody wanted to be caught off guard if the predators decided to invade the town's main street. In normal circumstances, coyotes wouldn't challenge a human settlement openly, but desperation can drive all creatures to unimaginable lengths. The Mustang tried once more to drink, but the water was now muddied by its frantic splashing. It coughed and spat, side heaving with exertion. Ethan felt compelled to act. Without fully understanding why, he darted toward the livery stable at the far end of the street. He tugged open the creaking doors and found an old burlap sack half filled with oats. He wasn't sure if it was fresh or infested with weevils, but he grabbed it anyway. Rushing back outside, he approached the Mustang cautiously, hands trembling. The boy's heart pounded like a hammer in his ears. He could see the raw fear in the horse's eyes. If it lashed out, Ethan knew he could be kicked or trampled in an instant. But that possibility didn't stop him. He lowered the sack, letting a small pile of oats spill onto the ground. The Mustang glared at him, every muscle tense. Yet the need for sustenance was overpowering. The Mustang jerked forward, nostrils flaring, and sniffed the grain. It took a tentative bite, then another. The relief was palpable. Onlookers exhaled, tension draining from the scene for a brief second. A few daring souls tiptoed closer, though they kept a respectful distance. When the coyotes howled again, this time closer, a chill ran through everyone. The Mustang's ears swiveled, and it made a noise in its throat that was half wheeze, half neigh. Terror danced in its eyes, mixing with a grim determination to stay alive. Suddenly, a breeze swept through the street, stirring the fine dust on the ground into a swirl that momentarily clouded everyone's vision. The Mustang staggered back. Ethan dropped the sack, raising an arm to shield his face from the stinging grit. Through the dust, he glimpsed shadows sliding around the corner of a nearby building. The coyotes were here. They'd arrived, skulking low to the ground, eyes shining with a feral hunger that matched the Mustang's desperation. Usually, coyotes would keep their distance from people, but the sight of this frail, half-dead horse and the clamor in the street must have emboldened them. A wiry man named Judd, known around town for being a crack shot with his rifle, lifted his weapon and fired a warning shot into the air. The report echoed off the buildings, and for a split second, the coyotes flinched back. But the Mustang reeled from the gunshot's blast, nearly crashing into Ethan. The boy dove aside just in time, hitting the ground hard, shoulders slamming into the dirt. He tasted blood on his lip, felt the sting of rocks scraping his skin, but scrambled back to his feet. Adrenaline flooded his veins, the roar of his heartbeat deafening in his ears. Callahan barked at Judd to take it easy, muttering that the Mustang was already scared out of its mind. The gunshots wouldn't help. But the immediate problem remained, the coyotes. More had gathered, 5 or 6 in total, darting in and out of shadows near the street's end. The men with rifles took positions, forming a line near the center of the dusty road, while Ethan, the Mustang, and a handful of others stood by the trough in a tense cluster. For an agonizing moment, no one moved. The Mustang stood, sides heaving, as the townsfolk tried to figure out the best way to protect it without risking an all-out confrontation with wild animals. One coyote, bolder than the rest, slunk forward, its lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth. It sniffed the air and let out a low growl. The Mustang snorted in alarm, almost toppling over again as it attempted to wheel around and face this new threat. Callahan cursed under his breath and swung his rope in a wide circle, hoping the motion might scare the coyote off. The rope whistled through the air, stirring the dust at his feet, but the coyote only flinched slightly. Hunger was etched into every line of the predator's gaunt frame. It took another creeping step. Before the situation could escalate further, the Mustang made a sudden break for it. Driven by some last reserve of adrenaline, the horse galloped away from the trough, pounding across the dusty street. This abrupt movement startled the coyotes, who veered aside, scattering in a wide arc. People yelled after the Mustang, but it was already heading toward a gap between 2 buildings. The men with rifles turned, trying to see if they could redirect the horse or at least keep the predators from chasing it. Ethan sprinted after the Mustang without hesitation, legs pumping hard, ignoring the sting of his scraped skin. The Mustang's wild flight led it toward the edge of town, where the desert resumed its harsh, endless sprawl. But there, standing like a sentinel from a bygone era, was an old abandoned stable. It had once been used by traveling merchants before the railroad bypassed this stretch of land, but now it stood empty and dilapidated, a ghost of better times. With the coyotes yipping at its heels, the Mustang lunged toward this ramshackle structure. The building's roof sagged ominously, and its walls were riddled with gaps, but it was still shelter of a sort. Dust flew from the Mustang's hooves in swirling clouds as it skidded into the stable, sides smashing against the wooden doorway. Ethan arrived moments later, panting heavily, sweat trickling down his temples. He peered inside the darkness of the stable, heart racing. The Mustang stood in the center of the decaying space, flanks quivering. It was bleeding from a shallow cut on one hind leg, likely scraped by a jutting nail or splinter. Outside, the coyotes prowled in a loose circle, their silhouettes shifting in the hot, unrelenting sunlight. The rest of the townsfolk, or at least those brave enough to follow, approached cautiously, rifles at the ready. Inside the stable, a hush descended. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that filtered through the broken roof. The Mustang's labored breathing echoed in the cramped space. One of the stable's gates was collapsed, the hinges rusted through. A pile of old, moldy hay lay in one corner, and scattered horse tack, long since chewed by rats, hung on the walls. Despite this less than ideal environment, it was still a sanctuary compared to the open street. Ethan approached the Mustang slowly. His heart hammered so violently he felt it might leap out of his chest. He whispered gentle words, though he wasn't sure if the horse recognized any soothing tone. As the boy drew closer, the Mustang's ears flicked back and forth, uncertain whether to trust this small human. Finally, when Ethan was just a foot or two away, he extended a trembling hand. He paused, letting the horse see and smell him first. He kept his eyes slightly lowered, just enough to not appear like a threat. For an agonizing moment, the Mustang seemed poised to either collapse or lash out. Its wild gaze flickered as though it was trying to process whether this newcomer was friend or foe. Then, in a moment that defied the tension around them, the Mustang allowed Ethan to rest a hand lightly on its neck. The horse's skin twitched at the contact, but it didn't bolt. Outside, the coyotes prowled impatiently. The townsfolk gathered around the stable entrance, forming a rough barricade, prepared to ward off the predators with bullets if it came down to it. A conversation broke out in hushed, urgent tones about whether it was wise to keep the Mustang here or drive it out into the desert. Resources were scarce. Water was precious. And the Mustang's presence, along with the coyotes, posed a risk to the town. Ethan heard them muttering behind him but tuned them out. As he pressed his palm against the Mustang's quivering neck, he felt the raw bones beneath its coat and the feverish heat that suggested dehydration. The stench of neglect and fear clung to the horse's hide. It hurt his heart to see such a proud creature reduced to this state. He didn't know much about horses beyond what he'd learned from occasional chores at the local ranches, but he knew enough to realize that without immediate help, the horse might not survive another night. When he glanced back at the others, he could see conflicting emotions on their faces. Some were frightened or worried about the town's limited resources. Others were clearly moved by the horse's desperate plight and wanted to help. Callahan, standing near the door, wore a conflicted look. He'd seen enough horses in his lifetime to know when one was on its last legs. As the heat of the midday sun bore down on the roof, the coyotes began testing the perimeter. One by one, they crept closer, sniffing at gaps in the stable's walls. A rifle crack split the air again. Someone fired a shot into the dirt to scare them off. The coyotes retreated a few yards but did not flee entirely. They sensed weakness within the stable and were determined to wait for their chance. Tension buzzed through the people who stood watch. No one wanted a confrontation, but no one was ready to surrender the horse. Something about the Mustang's sheer will to make it this far roused a protective instinct in them. Ethan felt sweat sliding down the back of his neck. The stable was stifling, offering little ventilation, and the Mustang's ragged exhalations filled the stale air. He knew they had to get fresh water and some medical attention for the horse, but he also realized that any movement outside might provoke the coyotes. He looked over his shoulder at Callahan, then at the small crowd gathered. "We need to help it," the boy said, his voice cracking slightly with urgency. "We can't just let it die." No one answered immediately, but a few gave small nods of agreement. The logic was simple enough: if they abandoned the Mustang, it would die, and the coyotes might become even bolder, associating the town with easy prey. If they saved it, perhaps that sense of purpose and community might help stave off the town's slow decline. Amid the silent tension, the Mustang's legs buckled. It sank to its knees, trembling all over. Ethan moved aside in alarm, feeling helpless. He turned to the others. "Water!" he pleaded. "We need water!" The urgency in his voice spurred two men to run back toward the center of town. They would have to gather what they could. The town's well was shallow, and every drop was precious in these parts. Nonetheless, they hurried to fill buckets and bring them back, ignoring the risk that the coyotes might try to cut them off. The rest of the group waited in tense silence, rifles ready, eyes scanning the horizon. After what felt like an eternity, one of the men returned, splashing half the water in the dirt as he sprinted. He passed the bucket to Ethan, who carefully carried it toward the Mustang. The horse looked up, nostrils flaring, and tried to stand, but its weakened body wouldn't comply. Ethan knelt beside it, scooping water into his cupped hand and bringing it to the Mustang's muzzle. The horse drank greedily, lips smacking as it swallowed. Some of the water trickled down its chin, darkening the dust on the stable floor. Ethan repeated this again and again, each handful of water revitalizing the horse just a little bit more. Outside, the coyotes circled, but the rifles and the shouting of the townsfolk kept them at bay for now. Ethan could sense that it was only a matter of time before the predators grew daring again. As the horse continued to drink, Ethan felt a small surge of hope. He whispered reassurance, though he wasn't sure the horse understood or cared about the words. All that mattered was that it was receiving vital water, that it was still alive. The Mustang's eyes fluttered shut momentarily, as if savoring this brief moment of relief. When it finished drinking all that remained, the horse coughed and tried again to stand. It managed to get its front legs beneath it but failed with the hind legs. Callahan stepped forward with an air of gentle authority, setting his rope aside. He gave Ethan a curt nod and signaled for the boy to move back. Then, ever so carefully, Callahan slipped a hand under the Mustang's belly and pressed his other palm against the horse's flank, applying just enough pressure to assist. The Mustang managed to rise into a shaky stance. It swayed but remained upright. Outside, a fresh round of howls pierced the air. The coyotes had multiplied, or maybe more had joined from the surrounding desert. Their voices sounded more confident, a chilling crescendo of hunger and anticipation. Rifle shots barked again. Dust kicked up. A few of the coyotes dashed away, but they didn't retreat entirely. They skulked around the perimeter of the stable, jaws parted, tongues lolling as they panted in the heat. It was a standoff that couldn't hold forever. The Mustang half-stepped, half-stumbled in the cramped space, nearly crashing into a broken wooden partition. The thought of those predators waiting just yards away seemed to sap the horse's composure, fueling its panic. Callahan spoke quietly. "We need to find a better way to scare them off," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Or we'll be stuck in here all day, and that horse is not gonna last." Ethan listened, still gripping the empty bucket. The tension outside thickened. Someone shouted about lighting torches to keep the coyotes at bay. Another suggested a controlled shot that might wound or kill one of them to send a message. But as the men debated, the Mustang's panic rose. It snorted, pawing at the ground, ears pinned back, eyes rolling white. It had been pushed beyond reason by hunger and exhaustion. Another rifle blast made it jerk violently. For a terrifying second, Ethan thought the horse might stampede straight through the crowd inside the stable. Suddenly, the Mustang lunged forward. A piece of rotted wood on the floor gave way under its hooves, and it nearly crashed face first into the hay. The horse let out a shrill cry that sent goosebumps racing up Ethan's arms. The group scrambled to avoid being crushed. The boy reached out instinctively, trying to steady the Mustang, but he was far too small to hold back such power. The horse's weight bore down, forcing a groan from the broken floorboards. A plume of dust rose in the stable, thick enough to choke on. Coughing, Ethan stumbled back, eyes stinging. Everyone inside felt a flare of alarm. If the horse broke through the floor or brought the roof down, it might be trapped beyond any hope of rescue. Gritting his teeth, Callahan seized the rope again, gingerly looping it around the horse's neck. He didn't pull tightly, just enough to assert some sense of direction. The Mustang snorted, flanks still trembling, but something in Callahan's firm, steady manner seemed to anchor it. Slowly, methodically, he guided the horse away from the rotted spot on the floor, closer to a corner of the stable where the boards were more solid. "Easy now," he murmured, voice low. "We're trying to help, horse." That an animal so near collapse could still possess enough panic to potentially destroy its surroundings was a testament to how intense survival instincts can be. It was a raw, terrifying power. The rest of the men and women in the stable formed a ragged semicircle, giving the Mustang enough space but staying close enough to aid if it collapsed again. One of them, a rancher named Susanna, dashed outside to check on the coyotes. She fired 2 shots into the sky, the bullets zipping overhead with a crack. The yipping receded slightly. Through the gaping stable entrance, Ethan could see the shapes of those predators slinking away from the immediate area. But it wouldn't last long. Hunger would drive them back soon enough. They needed more than momentary reprieve, they needed a plan. The Mustang's fate hinged on whether they could protect it from the pack, supply it with enough water and nourishment, and calm its panic. That desperation lent the scene a throbbing urgency that refused to abate. Everything felt precarious, as though the slightest misstep could tip them into tragedy. The building groaned again under a gust of wind. A swirl of dust eddied inside. The Mustang laid its ears back, as if suspecting the wind itself might be another threat. Ethan noticed that the horse's coat was dotted with old, healed-over scars, jagged lines crisscrossing its hide, souvenirs from fights with mountain lions or other predators. It had lived a hard life in the wild, sustaining numerous injuries and outrunning who knew how many hunters or storms. Yet for all that toughness, it was on its knees now, relying on the mercy of strangers. The boy couldn't help feeling a kinship with it, a sense that he, too, was stuck in a place where the odds were never in his favor. He reached out again, letting the Mustang smell his hand before placing it gently on its shoulder. The horse's flesh twitched, but this time it didn't pull away. Perhaps, in some unspoken way, it sensed he meant no harm. The chatter in the stable drifted to Ethan's ears. They were discussing how to fortify the walls, how to keep the coyotes out, and how to fetch more water without inviting an attack. One of the men proposed creating a makeshift barrier using old planks and broken furniture. Another suggested building a fire around the perimeter to deter the coyotes, but the risk of starting a full-blown blaze in such dry conditions was immense. The debate carried a frantic edge because every minute counted. The Mustang was still dangerously dehydrated and starving. It needed proper care, not just a few handfuls of water. Ethan remembered the sack of oats back by the trough. If it was still there, that could provide at least some nourishment. But going back out meant exposing himself to the coyotes. He glanced at the stable's entrance, where the midday sun glared harshly, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the beams of light. Beyond that brightness lay the threat of sharp-toothed predators. He steeled himself. The boy had felt the Mustang's desperation. It deserved his courage. Without waiting for an adult to give permission, he started to edge toward the door. Callahan noticed, stepping into his path, gruff concern etched in the lines of his face. "Where are you going, kid?" he asked. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling his throat go dry. "The oats. They're by the trough. It needs more food." Callahan hesitated, his expression torn. The last thing he wanted was to see the boy become coyote bait. But then, scanning the stable, he realized that none of them had any viable feed for the horse inside. Time was running out. He gave a curt nod, then gestured for one of the riflemen, Judd, to accompany Ethan. Judd was the same man who'd fired warning shots earlier. He had a stubble beard and a perpetual squint from years under the desert sun. "Quickly now," Callahan added, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll keep an eye out from here." Ethan's stomach twisted in knots as he inched toward the threshold. The sunlight outside was blinding after the dim interior. He heard the scuttling sounds of movement along the town's edge, likely the coyotes still circling. Judd, rifle in hand, stepped out first, scanning left and right. The street was eerily silent, except for a faint breeze that rustled the wooden buildings. With a quick hand signal, Judd motioned for Ethan to follow. They moved in short bursts, darting from one spot of cover to another. The boy's heart pounded so hard he thought it might echo off the buildings. When they reached the trough, Ethan saw the sack of oats just as he'd left it. The corner had spilled open, forming a small mound in the dust. Flies buzzed around the soggy puddle of water from earlier. Ethan grabbed the sack, wincing at how little remained. But any amount would be better than nothing. He heard a low growl behind him and spun around, nearly dropping the oats. A coyote stood no more than 30 feet away, its dark eyes gleaming with hunger. It bared its teeth and took a step closer. Judd muttered a curse under his breath, raising his rifle. The coyote froze, hackles raised. A single shot rang out, tearing up the dirt mere inches from the predator's paws. With a startled yelp, it spun and darted behind the corner of a building. Judd didn't fire again, possibly to conserve bullets or to avoid drawing more coyotes than necessary. Clutching the sack to his chest, Ethan felt relief pour through him like cool water. Together, they started back to the stable, every sense on high alert. Another coyote appeared at the far end of the street, but it kept its distance, wary of the gun. From the stable door, others peered out, waving them on. The tension was a palpable force pressing against their chests. Each step felt painfully slow, though in reality they were rushing across the open space as fast as they could. Finally, they reached the stable, ducking inside just as two more coyotes came skulking around the edge of a nearby wagon. Callahan slammed a makeshift barricade in place, piling planks of wood against the entrance to give them at least some measure of security. Dust rained down from above as the boards clattered and settled. Ethan wasted no time. He tore open the burlap sack, letting the Mustang see and smell the oats. The horse's eyes, still ringed with fatigue, widened with recognition. Its muzzle quivered in anticipation. Ethan scooped some into his palm and offered them to the horse. The Mustang eagerly licked them up, crunching the grains with what strength it had left. A faint sense of relief spread through the stable as everyone realized they were at least temporarily safer. The barricade wouldn't hold forever, but it might deter the coyotes for the moment. Judd wiped sweat from his brow, glancing around at the group. "We can't stay cooped up here," he grumbled. "We'll run out of supplies, and that pack ain't likely to go away soon." A heavy silence fell. Everyone knew he was right. The question was, what could they do? The Mustang was still in dire condition. Shaking their heads, they acknowledged the harsh truth. They were in a survival scenario not only for the horse but for themselves. No one wanted to see the Mustang turned into coyote fodder, but risking human lives for an animal was also a tough sell in a place where life was already precarious. Exhaustion started to set in, and the hours dragged on. A few men and women took turns peering through the gaps in the stable's walls, keeping watch on the coyotes. The predators were cunning, slinking in and out of view, waiting for nightfall perhaps. The scorching midday heat began to wane slightly, but the tension didn't let up. The Mustang dozed on its feet, occasionally stirring or flinching at small noises. Ethan stayed close, gently rubbing the horse's neck, feeling its sweat-damp coat. He tried to feed it more oats whenever the Mustang showed interest. Each nibble of food felt like a small victory. Outside, the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the desert. A hush fell over the town as people retreated inside their houses or the saloon, uncertain of how the night would unfold. The stable grew dim, lit only by the fading daylight that slanted through the cracks in the roof. A hush of fatigue swept over the group. They were tired, hungry, and fraught with anxiety. Nobody dared to light a lantern. The glow might draw the coyotes closer. Instead, they sat in semi-darkness, listening to the Mustang's ragged breathing and the distant howls of the predators. In that dusky gloom, Ethan felt a wave of helplessness creep over him. His muscles ached from tension and from the tumble he'd taken earlier. He thought about his father, who had died a few years back when a rattlesnake spooked his horse during a cattle drive. Since then, Ethan had been living with his aunt, scraping by. He never felt like he truly belonged in this dusty nowhere. Now he found himself trying to save a horse that was, in many ways, a reflection of his own lost, desperate feelings. If they couldn't protect this Mustang, if they let it die at the edge of town, would that reflect something about the boy himself? The thought gnawed at him. A rustle of movement snapped Ethan out of his reverie. The Mustang stirred, letting out a pained snort. It started pacing restlessly in the small confines of the stable, clearly disliking the enclosure but too weak to fight its way out. The battered floor creaked beneath its hooves. Everyone stood alert, shifting aside to make room for the anxious animal. Its eyes darted from one person to another, searching for an escape or a threat. Callahan whispered, "We gotta keep it calm. A horse that panics in close quarters can do a lot of damage." He gestured for Ethan to approach, evidently noticing the boy had a calming effect. Ethan stepped forward, speaking in soft tones. He placed a hand on the Mustang's shoulder again, feeling the heat under its skin. Gradually, the horse's frantic movements slowed, and it settled into a tense stillness. Outside, the wind changed, blowing from the desert into town. The stench of coyote musk drifted in, a pungent reminder of the danger lurking beyond the wooden walls. The animals were still out there. A cold feeling slithered down Ethan's spine. They all knew that as darkness descended fully, the coyotes might grow bolder. Even the best shooters couldn't see as well at night, and if the pack decided to rush the stable, there could be casualties. That sense of impending confrontation made the quiet inside even more suffocating. One of the men, Tom, a burly fellow with a bandaged arm from a past accident, spoke up in a low voice. "We can't let them hem us in. If they surround the stable, we won't have a clean shot. We should build a bigger perimeter, set up torches or something." A murmur of agreement passed through those gathered. They began discussing how to scrounge up materials that could burn without setting the entire town on fire. Another man mentioned a stack of old crates by the saloon. Someone else recalled a store of kerosene in the blacksmith's shop. But it was all scattered around the town. Collecting those supplies under the watchful eyes of a coyote pack at dusk was no small task. Ethan tightened his hand into a fist, frustration mounting. He felt every second ticking away. The Mustang still looked half dead, muzzle flecked with foam, legs shaky. Yet it clung to life, as though too stubborn to let go. The boy made a silent promise to the horse. He would do whatever it took to keep it alive. Summoning courage he didn't know he had, Ethan said, "We have to do something now. If we wait till it's pitch dark, we won't stand a chance." Judd, hearing the boy's words, nodded. He and a few others volunteered to go out and gather supplies while the light still held. Callahan, after a moment's hesitation, handed Ethan a small revolver. It was old, the barrel scratched, but it had bullets loaded. "In case things go bad," he muttered, glancing at the door. Ethan swallowed hard, not entirely sure he could fire a gun at a living creature if pressed. But the weight of it in his hand felt strangely reassuring. With that, Judd and the small group slipped out, rifles at the ready, heading toward the blacksmith's shop. Inside the stable, time slowed to a crawl. The Mustang let out a low, trembling nicker, shifting its weight from side to side. The men left behind rechecked their firearms, making sure they were ready to repel any bold coyote that tried to push through the barricade. Ethan stood beside the Mustang, the revolver awkward in his belt. He tried to keep calm, but his heart hammered relentlessly, and sweat dripped from his temples. Each second of silence seemed an amplifier for the anxious thoughts racing through his mind. Minutes passed like hours. Dusk deepened, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple before giving way to a dark, star-speckled expanse. The Mustang seemed to rest its head lower, eyelids drooping, perhaps on the edge of sleep or unconsciousness. Ethan feared it might slip away quietly, and he kept stroking its neck, softly urging it to stay with them. The men stationed at the stable's gaps whispered quick updates. They saw shapes moving in the distance, but no sign of Judd and the others yet. The coyotes howled again, and the sound was closer, more numerous. It felt like a slow siege. Finally, the quiet broke with frantic footsteps outside. Judd and his group stumbled back into view, arms laden with wood, kerosene, and a few torches. The coyotes lunged from the shadows, snapping at their heels. 2 rifle shots fired in quick succession. One coyote let out a blood-curdling yelp and rolled in the dust. The rest scattered momentarily. This gave the men just enough time to heave their cargo into the stable. They slammed the barricade shut behind them, gasping for air. Ethan's eyes went wide at the sight of the wounded coyote outside, still thrashing weakly. It was a grisly reminder of how dangerous this situation was for all involved, man and beast. Jed breathed hard, face slick with sweat. "We didn't have time to grab more," he wheezed. "Those devils were waiting for us." Indeed, the group had only a handful of crates and 2 canisters of kerosene. They'd managed to fashion a few torches from rags wrapped around sticks. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They worked quickly in the dimness, setting up a plan to create a ring of flames around the stable's entrance. Tom suggested they soak some planks in kerosene and place them on the street. If they could light them, perhaps that would form a barrier the coyotes wouldn't cross. The main worry was losing control of the fire. Still, it was a risk they had to take. As they prepared, the Mustang let out a weary whinny. The commotion, the smell of kerosene, the tension in the air, it all seemed to rattle the horse. Yet it managed to stay on its feet, as if it sensed these people were fighting for its survival too. Callahan and Judd hoisted one of the crates to the stable door, preparing to shove it out and ignite it. A man named Marcus held a torch. His hands shook visibly. When they opened a gap in the barricade wide enough to slide the crate through, a coyote lunged into view, snarling, fangs flashing. Callahan roared in alarm, ramming the crate forward. The coyote collided with it and recoiled, letting out a vicious growl as it scurried back. Marcus jammed the torch against the kerosene-soaked wood, and flames roared up, painting the night in flickering orange. The heat radiated immediately, making everyone squint and sweat. At the sudden burst of fire, a chorus of howls erupted, and Ethan saw multiple pairs of glowing eyes in the darkness, reflecting the flames. The coyotes paced just beyond the firelight, uncertain whether to challenge the inferno. 1 or 2 made daring feints, but were driven back by the intense heat. Another shot cracked the air, scattering them again. Under the wavering glow of the flames, the stable seemed like an island in a sea of shadows. The townsfolk fanned out behind their makeshift barrier of fire, hoping it would last the night without burning the entire street down. Inside, Ethan was drenched in sweat. He turned back to the Mustang. The horse panted heavily, foam flecking its lips. It had eaten some oats, drunk some water, but it was still dangerously weak. Its eyes flicked to the flames outside, then to Ethan, as if trying to decide if this was safety or just another nightmare. The boy continued to murmur soft words, though his throat was parched and scratchy. He wanted to reassure the horse, to make it feel less alone. Deep down, he felt a kinship that transcended the barrier between species. Both of them were fighting for a place in a world that seemed determined to grind them down. With the perimeter of flames in place, the coyotes' attacks ebbed. Their howls filled the night at irregular intervals, each one making the horse startle. But for the time being, they kept their distance. One by one, the townsfolk took turns resting. Some dozed in corners of the stable, rifles cradled in their arms, ready for the next wave. Others kept watch, feeding the fire with scraps of wood to maintain the barrier. The hours of darkness stretched on, a tense vigil where every snap of a twig or shift of the wind set nerves on edge. At some point late into the night, the Mustang sank to its knees again, and Ethan worried that it might be giving up. He rushed to get another bucket of water. A couple of men had bravely risked the well again, returning with just enough to keep the Mustang's thirst at bay. Ethan offered sips of water, coaxing the horse to drink, whispering that it had to hold on till morning. The Mustang swallowed with difficulty, but it swallowed. Outside, the flames crackled, throwing dancing shadows on the stable walls. Then a bone-chilling sound pierced the darkness. The coyotes were drawing closer, no longer content to wait for the flames to die down on their own. Their glowing eyes bobbed up and down in the distance as they paced, searching for a point of weakness. Tension gripped everyone once more. The men stoked the fire, tossing in whatever flammable scraps they had left. Sparks flew into the night sky, carried by the wind. If the wind shifted the wrong way, it could blow embers onto the wooden buildings, and the whole town might catch fire. But there was no time to worry about that now. Survival took precedence. A burst of snarls and yips erupted. Several coyotes tried to rush the flames. Gunshots rang out. The stable door shuddered as a frantic scuffle broke out outside. People shouted, rifles popping. A coyote managed to leap through a gap in the barricade. It hit the ground inside the stable with a furious snarl. The men whirled, trying to aim. The Mustang let out a terrified squeal. In the chaos, the coyote lunged for the horse's hind leg. Before it could land a bite, a shot thundered from behind. The coyote convulsed and slumped to the ground, bleeding into the dirt. Smoke from the gun barrel curled in the flickering torchlight. Ethan realized he was the one holding the revolver. The recoil left his arms shaking violently. He stared at the fallen coyote, disbelief etched on his face. He hadn't even thought, his body had acted on instinct, fueled by a desperate need to protect the Mustang. Around him, the stable erupted in commotion. Callahan and the others slammed the barricade closed again, shoving crates and planks back into place. A wave of howls outside indicated the pack had retreated once more. The stench of gunpowder lingered, mingling with the acrid smell of burning kerosene and the metallic tang of blood. The Mustang stood trembling, eyes wide with terror, but it was unhurt. Ethan dropped the revolver, adrenaline leaving his body in a rush. He felt sick, tears pricking his eyes, but he blinked them away. There was no time to dwell on what had just happened. Survival overshadowed everything else. Someone dragged the dead coyote's body away from the Mustang, tossing it outside onto the flames. The sickening scent of burning fur made Ethan gag, but at least it would serve as a deterrent to the others. The rest of the night passed in a tense blur. The coyotes tested the perimeter a few more times but seemed spooked by the fire and the violence. They could smell death in the air. Meanwhile, the Mustang teetered between total collapse and a fitful, wavering strength. It would rest for a few minutes, then spook at the slightest noise. Ethan stayed awake, dozing only in brief intervals, sometimes slumping against the horse's flank as he fought fatigue. Morning eventually clawed its way over the horizon, bathing the desert in a pale, colorless light. The coyotes finally slunk away, perhaps realizing there would be no easy meal here. As dawn broke, everyone in the stable breathed a collective sigh of relief. The night had been a trial by fire, quite literally. They'd managed to protect the Mustang, and the stable hadn't burned down. The street outside was scorched black where the barrier of flames had stood, and the body of the coyote Judd had shot earlier lay half buried in ash. Townspeople emerged from their homes, looking haggard and uneasy. Some quietly thanked those who had held the stable, while others complained about the potential damage to their property. But overall, there was a sense that they'd survived something remarkable. Now came the question of what to do with the Mustang in the light of day. The horse was still too weak to walk much farther, and the stable was only a temporary solution. The townsfolk gathered, forming a circle in the dusty yard outside. Ethan stood near the Mustang, who was draped in a makeshift blanket to shield it from the morning chill. An uneasy debate arose. Some said it was time to release the horse back into the wild. Others claimed the horse was too frail. Letting it go would be a death sentence. Water and feed were limited. Could the town afford to keep nursing it back to health when their own resources were scarce? In the midst of this, Ethan stepped forward. He spoke with a trembling voice, but there was a conviction in his words that made everyone stop and listen. He recounted how the Mustang had wandered into their town on the brink of death, how they had all fought together, risked their lives, to save it from the coyotes. He reminded them of the horse's will to survive, how it hadn't given up even when it could barely stand. Finally, he looked around at each face. "If we saved it just to let it die again," he said, voice cracking, "then what was the point of last night?" A hush followed. Even those who had been against the idea of caring for a wild horse seemed moved by the boy's passion. Eventually, Callahan spoke up, fixing Ethan with a look that carried both resignation and respect. "We'll do what we can," he declared. A ripple of agreement traveled through the group, and people dispersed to gather more supplies. They had battered down a huge barrier, quite literally, to keep this horse alive. It only felt right to finish what they started. Still, no one was under the illusion that it would be easy. The Mustang was far from healthy. Coyotes still lurked on the outskirts, possibly waiting for another chance. And the desert climate took its toll on everything. But for the first time, there was a spark of unity in the town. People who rarely spoke to each other found themselves cooperating, pooling resources, and sharing knowledge. They set about creating a more solid enclosure for the horse, a pen behind the stable that could provide some security without confining the Mustang in complete darkness. Ethan and a few others worked all day, hammering together wooden planks, reinforcing them with nails scavenged from old crates. The Mustang was led, slowly and carefully, out of the dilapidated stable into this new pen. It limped along, every step shaky. A veterinarian was nowhere to be found in this isolated region, so they had to rely on folk remedies. Susanna, who'd cared for horses on her ranch, tended to the Mustang's wounds. She cleaned and dressed the cut on its hind leg, rubbed salves into the raw patches of skin. Others brought small amounts of feed, mostly leftover oats, and a few handfuls of hay. Water was rationed from the well, but they made sure the Mustang had enough to drink. At first, the horse was skittish and confused by the pen, rearing or trying to back away any time someone came close with a pail or brush. But gradually, as the day wore on and the sun rose high in the sky, it seemed to accept that these people meant no harm. It endured the treatments with minimal fuss, though it still had wild eyes that darted to the horizon whenever a coyote's distant howl drifted on the wind. Each day they survived was a testament to a fragile new alliance between a battered Mustang and a group of townsfolk who had rallied behind it. Evening arrived without incident, and the sense of relief was profound. People shared small smiles, passing around a jug of water, sipping sparingly. They felt like they were on the brink of something hopeful, as though the town's very spirit was rekindling through the act of saving this single horse. Still, no one took anything for granted. They kept rifles within arm's reach and formed nightly watches. The coyotes, though scattered, were still out there. Over the next few days, the Mustang's conditions slowly improved. It stood more steadily, walked with less hobble. Its coat, though still ragged, regained a slight sheen from regular brushing and care. The townsfolk named it valor, for the courage it displayed in surviving so many ordeals. Ethan beamed every time he said the name, proud that he'd suggested it. He spent hours with Valor, reading the horse's moods and quirks. At times, the Mustang would jerk away or snort in alarm, as if haunted by past traumas. But Ethan's quiet persistence seemed to soothe it. He would lean against the fence, talking softly about anything that came to mind, his father's memory, his dreams of seeing places beyond the desert, or just the color of the sunrise that morning. Whether or not the horse understood the words, it appeared to find comfort in the boy's calm presence. Through this slow process of healing, the memory of that desperate first night remained etched in their minds. The townsfolk still marveled at how the Mustang had staggered into their midst, half dead, and how they had fought together against the coyotes. Many admitted, with a touch of sheepishness, that they initially doubted the horse's chances. Some had even argued to let nature take its course. Yet now, seeing the Mustang move about in the pen, eyes brighter, appetite returning, it felt like witnessing a miracle. Some wondered if the Mustang was a sign, a reminder that survival is possible in the harshest conditions. A week passed, and though Valor was by no means fully recovered, the horse had improved enough to trot a few steps around the pen without collapsing. The scars on its body were still visible, but the wound on its leg had scabbed over. Callahan shook his head in something like awe whenever he watched the horse. He'd seen strong livestock succumb to far less. But this Mustang's will to live was unlike anything he'd encountered. Ethan's bond with Valor grew deeper each day. The boy brought small treats, an apple core here, a carrot stub there, remnants scrounged from the meager kitchen scraps. Valor would gently lip them from his hand, snorting softly as though in gratitude. It was a quiet, peaceful ritual in a town that had known too much strife. People passing by would sometimes pause, leaning on the fence to watch the boy and the horse. It gave them a momentary escape from their worries about the dryness of the well, the scarcity of supplies, and the unpredictability of desert life. Of course, not everyone was fully convinced. Some pointed out that they were still burning through precious resources for one animal. Grumbles persisted about the cost of feed, the time spent guarding against coyotes, and the potential risk if the Mustang ever panicked in the pen. Yet these protests were overshadowed by an unspoken acknowledgement that the town needed a victory of some kind. Morale had been at an all-time low before the Mustang arrived. Now, there was a flicker of solidarity, a sense that they had banded together to accomplish something worthwhile. Then, out of nowhere, disaster loomed again, an approaching dust storm. Weather out here could turn treacherous quickly, and a wall of dust was spotted on the horizon one late afternoon. The sky turned a sickly yellow, and the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps between buildings. People rushed to board up windows, tie down loose items, and herd livestock into secure shelters. Ethan's first thought was valor. The new pen was sturdy, but it wasn't designed to withstand the full fury of a raging sandstorm. If they left the horse outside, swirling grit might choke it. But if they brought it into a building, would it panic again like it did in the old stable? Time was short. The storm front advanced, blotting out the setting sun. A red-brown haze devoured the sky, and gusts of wind buffeted the town, sending plumes of sand skittering across the ground. Callahan, Ethan, and a few others stood by Valor's pen, debating their options. The horse already sensed the change in weather, stomping anxiously, nostrils flaring. They decided the best bet was to move Valor into the same stable where they'd sheltered before. Only this time, they'd prepare it better. They quickly cleared debris, patched the worst gaps with old blankets or planks, and laid down extra straw to give the horse a cleaner surface. Leading Valor toward the stable proved challenging. The howling wind kicked up stinging sand that peppered their exposed skin and spooked the horse. At one point, Valor balked, rearing slightly, eyes rolling with alarm. Ethan clung to the rope around the horse's neck, calling out soothing words that were nearly lost in the gale. Bit by bit, they inched forward, the wind threatening to unbalance them. By the time they finally shoved the stable door shut, sand was swirling in their hair and clothes, eyes burning from grit. Inside, the gloom was punctured by only a few flickering lanterns. The wind's roar outside was deafening, and the walls of the stable shook ominously. At times, it felt like the entire structure might be ripped from its foundation. The horse paced nervously, but Ethan stayed by its side, occasionally stroking its neck to reassure it they were safe, for the moment. Others hurried to reinforce the stable door, nailing boards across it, stuffing rags into cracks to block out the swirling dust. Despite their best efforts, sand seeped in through the gaps, coating the floor in a fine layer of grit. The air became suffocating, thick with dust. People coughed and covered their mouths with bandanas or scraps of cloth. Valor snorted repeatedly, shaking its head to clear its nostrils. It was a reminder that even with refuge, the storm was a tangible threat. For hours they huddled inside, battered by howling winds and the relentless hiss of sand against the wooden exterior. Every once in a while, the wind would slam the stable with a particularly ferocious gust, causing it to shudder. In those moments, Valor would spook, eyes wide. Ethan would grab the rope and speak calming words, though his own heart pounded with fear. He remembered how fragile everything felt during the Coyote siege, and this felt no different, a test of endurance. The nighttime darkness only heightened their vulnerability. But unlike that previous crisis, this time they had a plan, supplies, and a sense of unity. No one here wanted to see the Mustang succumb to the storm. Eventually, near dawn, the wind began to die down. The roar outside lessened to a steady moan, and then to a sporadic gust. When the first rays of sunlight crept through a crack in the stable, it revealed a layer of dust coating every surface inside. Eyes bleary, faces grimy, the townsfolk dared to push the door open slightly, peeking at the street beyond. The scene was bleak. Drifts of sand piled against buildings, burying doorways and shutters. The trough where Valor had first drunk was barely visible. But the worst of the storm had passed, and the stable still stood, battered but intact. Ethan led Valor out into the soft morning light. The horse's coat was caked in dust and sweat. Its eyes blinked as it beheld the transformed landscape, as though a fresh desert had been dropped overnight. But the Mustang was alive. Together, along with the exhausted townspeople, they surveyed the damage. Some roofs had partially collapsed, a few fences were torn down, but no one had died. It was a somber relief. People began the arduous task of digging out homes and businesses, brushing sand off porches, and checking on livestock. Despite the destruction, many paused to stroke Valor's muzzle or give it a pat on the neck, as if the horse had become the town's mascot of perseverance. If this battered Mustang could survive the desert, the coyotes, and a dust storm, perhaps the town itself could endure whatever nature threw at it. The sense of camaraderie that had kindled around the Mustang's plight now served as a galvanizing force in their recovery efforts. Neighbors helped each other shovel sand. Someone brewed a weak pot of coffee over a makeshift fire, passing around tin cups with a wry grin. In the days that followed, the repairs went hand in hand with caring for Valor. The horse seemed to adapt, even forging a wary tolerance of the stable. It still preferred open spaces, of course, but it allowed people to approach with brush and bucket without rearing or trying to bolt. A subtle trust began to blossom. Ethan felt it most profoundly whenever he looked into Valor's eyes. The horse no longer flinched at his presence, and sometimes even nickered softly when the boy approached, as if greeting a friend. Yet, no matter how much they cared for Valor, questions surfaced about the horse's future. Some said it should become a town horse, used for transport or errands. Others believed it was a wild creature at heart, and would never truly belong in captivity. Ethan remained silent whenever these debates cropped up, torn between wanting the horse to stay and sensing that a Mustang's spirit belonged in the open range. For now, though, the focus was on ensuring Valor regained full strength. Weeks passed. Valor's coat grew glossy in places where fur had been missing, and the horse put on some weight. The cut on its hind leg healed, leaving only a faint scar. The raw determination that had carried Valor into the town still shone in its eyes, but it was tempered now by a cautious acceptance of human care. It was an uneasy alliance, wild and tame, nature and nurture. Ethan spent more and more time with the horse, learning its moods, grooming it, even leading it on short walks around the outskirts of the town. The first time they did so, a hush fell over those who watched. They remembered that terrifying day when Valor first staggered into their midst. Now the Mustang walked with cautious dignity, its newly gained strength evident in each step. In that time, the coyotes kept their distance, seemingly intimidated by the memory of the previous confrontation. Nights were quieter, though the occasional distant howl still sent a shiver of unease through the town. The Mustang would prick its ears up at those sounds, but never showed the same raw panic as before. It had faced down predators, dust storms, and starvation, and survived. That resilience became a point of pride for everyone around. One dusk, as the sun painted the sky in fiery oranges and pinks, Ethan found himself alone with Valor outside the pen. He had guided the horse on a gentle walk to stretch its legs beyond the cramped enclosure. They stood near the very spot where Valor had collapsed weeks before, by the trough that had once held stagnant water. Now, the trough was refilled daily with fresh water from the well, partly in acknowledgement that animals, wild or domestic, sometimes needed a lifeline. Valor lowered its head and drank, the sloshing sound a reminder of just how far they'd come. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching. He thought about how the horse had changed not just his life, but the life of the entire town. Where once people were isolated, suspicious of each other, now they rallied behind common causes. Strangers had worked side by side, forging friendships in the crucible of shared danger. He wondered, with a pang, how long Valor would remain. Mustangs were free spirits, shaped by the wide plains and the never-ending desert sky. Could a fence, no matter how well built, truly contain that spirit forever? As if sensing his thoughts, Valor lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle. The horse turned, looking out toward the open desert. Beyond the town lay rolling sagebrush, distant hills, and the far horizon where the sky met the land. The sun was almost set, and the air had cooled. A gentle breeze rustled the Mustang's mane. In that moment, Ethan understood what came next, though it tore at his heart. Valor was healthier now, ready to return to the wild if given the chance. Keeping it penned might be the final betrayal of what they had fought so hard to save, its unbreakable spirit. That night, Ethan mustered the courage to voice this realization. He gathered the townsfolk by the stable, explaining in halting words that Valor belonged out there. Some nodded, having guessed as much. Others argued, suggesting the horse had earned a permanent home, or that it might not survive alone again. Yet deeper reflection softened most of those objections. They remembered how the Mustang had come to them, broken but undefeated, and how it had healed through an outpouring of compassion. The greatest kindness now might be to let it live freely in the land it knew best. Morning dawned crisp and clear. The coyotes were silent. The desert sparkled with a rare freshness after a light rainfall the night before. Ethan and a few of the townsfolk led Valor to the edge of town, where the dirt road dwindled into open range. The horse snorted, glancing around. It felt the wide expanse, ears pricked, tail swishing with anticipation. Some stood at a distance, arms folded, watching with solemn faces. This was the final chapter of a remarkable story, one that had tested everyone's resolve and reminded them of their shared humanity. Ethan was the one who removed the halter and rope from Valor's neck. He felt his hands tremble, tears blurring his vision. A tightness clutched at his chest, the kind of feeling you get when saying goodbye to someone you've grown to love. He stroked Valor's muzzle one last time, murmuring a quiet thanks. The horse blinked, exhaling softly, warm breath on the boy's hand. Then, with a sudden toss of its head, Valor trotted forward, gradually accelerating into a canter. Clouds of dust kicked up behind its hooves. The Mustang's mane streamed in the morning light, muscles rippling under a coat that had once been dull and matted. A hush fell over the gathered crowd. They watched as Valor galloped toward the horizon, each stride powerful and free. At one point, the horse paused on a small rise, turning its head back toward the town. For a heartbeat, it seemed to stare at the people who had nursed it back from death's door. Then it swung its head forward again and thundered away, diminishing into the vastness of the desert. The moment held a raw, bittersweet poignancy. A collective exhalation followed as the Mustang disappeared into the shimmering distance. In the silence that followed, Ethan wiped his eyes. A gentle hand on his shoulder startled him. It was Callahan. The old man gave a rare, genuine smile. "You did right by that horse," he said simply. Others murmured agreement. For once, the dusty little town felt vibrant with unspoken gratitude and pride. They had all been part of an extraordinary effort, saving a creature that represented the rugged, untamed spirit of the land. And in doing so, they'd rediscovered a spark of hope within themselves. Standing at the edge of that road, Ethan felt an unexpected lightness. Valor might be gone, but its legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had saved it. The boy turned to walk back into town with the others. A wave of relief and renewal coursed through him. Somehow, in saving the Mustang, they had also saved a part of themselves, the part that believes in second chances and the triumph of compassion over despair. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the rush of that rescue, the terror of the coyotes, or the relief of each sunrise that brought another day of life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others. Let us know in the comments, would you have kept the Mustang in town, or set it free to roam the wild? We upload stories like this every day at the same time, so hit that notification bell. Thank you for watching, and remember, no matter how dire the struggle, survival and second chances are always possible if we stand together.